Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath was the rabbi of Holy Blossom Synagogue in Toronto from 1929 to 1943. In this session, I'm going to talk about Rabbi Eisendrath's life. I'll talk about his personal and family history before he came to Toronto. I will talk about his arrival in Toronto and his interaction with the congregation regarding the principles of classical Reform Judaism. I'm going to talk about his attitudes regarding pacifism and Zionism. I want to talk about an episode involving the Ku Klux Klan, an episode which isn't very well known. And I'm going to talk a bit about his personal conception of Judaism. I'll wrap up by talking about his departure from Toronto and very briefly about his time as the leader of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations and his legacy. This session was originally presented July 7, 2020. It has been lightly edited, and a small bit of it has been re-recorded to fix some technical glitches and to correct some errors that were made during the original presentation. Maurice Nathan Eisendrath was born July 10, 1902 in Chicago. He was the son of Clara Osterreicher and Nathan Eisendrath. He attended religious school at Temple Emmanuel, which was a Reform congregation in Chicago. Felix Levy, who was the rabbi at Temple Emmanuel, was a neighbor and a family friend. And at age 5 or 6, young Maurice decided that he too wanted to become a rabbi. And he never wavered from that. In 1941, the family moved to Pittsburgh and they joined Rodef Shalom, also a Reform synagogue. And in 1918, at the young age of 16, Maurice Eisendrath went off to Cincinnati to begin his studies at Hebrew Union College. He wasn't there too long. In October, the students were all sent home because of an influenza outbreak. And a few days later, his father caught the disease and died. He might have remained in Pittsburgh, but his mother insisted he return to HUC and complete his studies. The program at Cincinnati at that time was an 8-year program held jointly with the University of Cincinnati. At the end, you graduated with both a bachelor's degree and your rabbinic ordination. And so in 1926, Rabbi Eisendrath was ordained. Next slide, if we can. Do we have the next slide? There he is in his graduation photo. That's Rabbi Eisendrath in the top row, second from the left. Eisendrath, I should say, is not a common name, and we have some information about its origin. In 1845, the Prussian government ordained that all Jews should adopt a hereditary name. And Samson Nathan in the town of Dorsten, which was in Westphalia in northwestern Germany, declared that his family would adopt the name Eisendrath, a name that they had actually already been using for some time. Samson Nathan Eisendrath was Maurice Nathan's great-great-grandfather. And Samson Nathan was an important member of the Jewish community in Dorsten. He arranged services, he acquired a Torah, he provided a room in his house where those services could be held. He was a co-author of the first statutes of the Jewish community in Dorsten. But the Jewish community in Dorsten was not peaceful. It was divided between traditional Jews on the one hand and the modernizers or progressives on the other hand. And Samson Nathan was a leader of the progressives. A booklet that was compiled in 1920 on the occasion of an Eisendrath family reunion in Dorsten documents some of the religious conflicts that occurred. In 1820, there was a conflict of some sort, leading even to violence within the synagogue. People complained to the mayor of Dorsten. He tried to bring in an outside rabbi to mediate. The mediation efforts were unsuccessful. And so it continued for many years. Finally, in 1847, Samson Nathan announced he was resigning from the congregation. He was warden of the congregation at that time, but he announced that he would now only participate in services voluntarily when he wished to, and should not be counted upon, nor should members of his family be counted upon to form a minyan. And so we have some evidence, even from the very beginning with Samson Nason, the proto-Eisendrath, of a rebellious, progressive, modernizing religious inclination. We don't know how much of that story was known to Maurice Eisendrath, but it certainly seems like somehow that nature and that religious inclination was transmitted to him. In September 1926, Maurice Eisendrath became the rabbi of Temple Israel in Charleston, West Virginia. In November 1926, he was born in 1902. So he went at age 16 to Cincinnati. He graduated at age 24. In 1926, he married Rosa Brown, who he had met as a student in Muskogee, Oklahoma. And we know from searches of the local newspaper archives that he was politically outspoken while he was in Charleston. He spoke out against religious instruction in the public schools. He gave a series of Friday evening sermons. The newspapers described them as lectures under the general heading Fallacies and Facts. One of them was Fallacies and Facts about Russia. And the newspaper reported, rather unusually, that at this lecture, there would be an open forum conducted afterwards at which members of the congregation who had contrary views could express themselves. So we have some indication that already at this point in his first year, there was disagreement within the congregation about his political thinking. Rabbi Eisendrath crossed swords with the Daughters of the American Revolution while he was in Charleston. Now, the DAR, for those of you who may not know, was a still is a patriotic political women's organization in the United States with chapters all across the country. In 1928, it was revealed that the DAR had a blacklist of communists, socialists, liberals, and pacifists who would not be permitted to be speakers at DAR functions. And included on this blacklist was Rabbi Stephen S. Wise, Susan Brandeis, who was the daughter of the Supreme Court Justice, and the Council of Jewish Women. Rabbi Eisendrath, in his rather unrestrained manner of oratory, pronounced that anyone who dares to raise up his voice in defense of the Negro, the Catholic, or the Jew is branded and undesirable and forbidden to speak at any meeting of the DAR. Eisendrath also became involved in presidential politics when he was in Charleston. In 1928, he campaigned for Al Smith, who was the Democratic candidate, against Herbert Hoover, the Republican candidate. Smith was a Roman Catholic, and his religion became a campaign issue. Eisendrath believed, of course, that a candidate should not be disqualified on account of his religion. And here's a quote from one of his speeches. "If I had to choose between being ruled by the Pope of Rome or the Grand Kleagle of the Ku Klux Klan, I would choose the Pope of Rome." Well, Smith did not win the election. He did not even carry the state of West Virginia. And Eisendrath's congregation, while they would have agreed with him denouncing religious prejudice, still was disturbed by his political positions. In the summer of 1929, Eisendrath announced he was resigning from Temple Israel and accepting a position at Holy Blossom in Toronto. And we don't know if he chose to seek out a new opportunity or if the Charleston congregation let it be known that they wanted to part ways. We do know that when he accepted the position with Holy Blossom, he had never been in Toronto before, or even in Canada. But so it happened that in 1929, Eisendrath and his wife Rosa packed up all their belongings, said goodbye to Temple Israel, this synagogue. Can we have the next slide? Said goodbye to Temple Israel and drove up to Toronto, where he was greeted by this site. Next slide. And here is Holy Blossom. Well, and thus began the Toronto chapter of Rabbi Eisendrath's career. The resemblance between the two buildings is obvious instantaneously. And Rabbi Eisendrath may have felt a sense of reassurance when he saw this, that here he was arriving at a place where he could understand where he was and what was happening and what it was about. But if he felt at ease, I should say that that did not last. Very quickly, he was involved in two controversies which threatened his continued tenure in Toronto. Here's what he wrote later about those first few days. Next slide, if we can. This is in 1929. This is what he wrote. How unprepared I was for what was to confront me when I arrived in Toronto to become the rabbi of Holy Blossom congregation. At age 27, having been exposed exclusively to the classical pattern of Reform Judaism, I was suddenly plunged into a vibrant community of some 40,000 Jews, of whom a bare couple of hundred families had belonged to Holy Blossom congregation. How completely shook up I was when I first realized there was a congregation in the ranks of Reform that was still so utterly unreformed, so steeped in orthodoxy, so as not to remove its hats in prayer. And that congregation was mine. Here's some of the differences that there were between Charleston and Toronto at the time. Charleston was a city of 50,000 people and 1,200 Jews. Toronto, a city of over 600,000 people and over 40,000 Jews. Temple Israel in Charleston had been legally organized in 1873, the same year as the UAHC was formed, and it was a charter member. Holy Blossom, as we know, began as an Orthodox congregation and did not have its first rabbi until 1920. And Zionism also was a point of difference between the two cities. Zionist organizations were active in America in 1929, but it was quite acceptable for a Reform rabbi not to be a Zionist. Toronto was very strongly Zionist, and Rabbi Isserman, who was Rabbi Eisendrath's predecessor, was a strong Zionist and urged members to contribute to Zionist causes. So Rabbi Eisendrath found himself dealing with two crises. One internal, should members of Holy Blossom be permitted to worship without their hats? And one external, because certain opinions, which Rabbi Eisendrath very quickly made known regarding Palestine, so enraged Toronto Zionists that there were calls immediately for him to be dismissed, even before he preached his first sermon at Holy Blossom. And these happened concurrently. It's difficult to know which to talk about first. I'm going to talk about the wearing of hats and more broadly, the acceptance of classical reform within Holy Blossom. But bear in mind, these happened simultaneously, and each controversy formed a background to the other. The sight of members of Holy Blossom praying with their hats on bothered Rabbi Eisendrath immensely. Being bareheaded to him was a totem of classical reform, and he wrote, I was definitely not going to be caught in the pulpit with my hat on. I would have felt like a hypocrite to pray and preach regularly, observing a practice which I had learned was pure custom or minhag, and in no wise din or prescribed law. Rosh Hashanah was only a few days away, but Eisendrath persuaded the president of the congregation to call a congregational meeting to consider a resolution that members be permitted to worship bareheaded. And after a lengthy debate, it passed by a very slim majority. Probably few of those who voted for the motion at that meeting understood that it would apply to the rabbi also, and that Eisendrath would choose himself to appear before the congregation bareheaded. And so when Rabbi Eisendrath entered the sanctuary on Erev Rosh Hashanah without a yarmulke, the congregation was astonished. Not that many of the congregational members had attended the congregational meeting. The resolution and Rabbi Eisendrath's pronouncements on it maybe was not that well known. And he made a dramatic entrance. We're used to seeing the service beginning with the rabbis and the cantor at the front of the congregation and everybody milling about, and eventually we take our seats and start. At Erev Rosh Hashanah 1929, Rabbi Eisendrath held back. The organ music announced the beginning of the service, and then Rabbi Eisendrath entered the sanctuary, and this is when the congregation cast their eyes upon him. 1,000 gasps, Rabbi Eisendrath wrote, gathering into bursts of whispers, spread through the congregation and exploded across the pews like a clap of long-delayed thunder. The roar continued for some time. I had to plead again and again for silence and the reverential beginning of the service of worship. How many were able to pray that night without the nagging of turbulently disturbed emotions is anyone's guess. Few left the services promptly. The foyer long resounded with bitter arguments between advocates and adversaries. That was that 1929 Erev Rosh Hashanah service. It may have been controversial, but Rabbi Eisendrath prevailed. In fact, by Yom Kippur, he writes, less than 25% of the men were wearing hats, and by the end of the year, there were only 1 or 2 holdouts. How did this happen? I think we have to say, at least in part, it was because of Rabbi Eisendrath's persuasive and oratorical skills. His sermon that Erev Rosh Hashanah was devoted to making the case for classical reform. We only have the manuscripts from that sermon. We don't have an audio recording. But when Rabbi Zola was here visiting us in 2017, he did play a recorded excerpt of Rabbi Eisendrath speaking. And what we heard, if you were there, was a rather distinctive style of speech, a clear baritone delivery with emphasis created through elongated vowels. Something like recordings you may have heard of FDR speaking, this style. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. And Rabbi Eisendrath spoke that way. And the argument he presented that night was based on a recognition that the world of our ancestors, when Jews lived in the ghetto, and the theology that once prevailed of the days of awe, that it was literally a time when our fate for the coming year was foreseen and sealed, that was no longer something that Jews believed. All this, Rabbi Eisendrath argued that Erev Rosh Hashanah had changed, and it was futile to think that we could return to it. And he said this: to those who would try to bring us back to those earlier days. To those who would inveigh against us, emphatically we reply that we are not so much worse than our ancestors, that we are not poorer Jews than our more orthodox forebears, that we are not to be designated as Gentiles, as faithless, as pig-eating pagans, wanting in reverence and piety, merely because that which inspired and edified our ancestors leaves us cold and untouched, merely because we gather, in some quarters at least, without hats and prayer shawls, without the caterwauling chants and beaten breasts, who pray rather with music and decorum and with our loved ones at our side. So Rabbi Eisendrath is gathering in here not just the worshiping bareheaded, but other aspects of classical reform. Dignified music, decorum, mixed seating. Rabbi Isserman, when he arrived at Holy Blossom, had written this in the Canadian Jewish Review: I shall be the spokesman neither of Reform, nor Conservative, nor Orthodox Judaism. I am a hyphenless Jew, to whose soul nothing is alien. Rabbi Eisendrath was serving notice, I think, that he was having none of that. Holy Blossom had hired a Reform rabbi, and emphatically, that is what he would be. I should add, that Rabbi Eisendrath did not criticize Orthodoxy just for being uninspiring and outdated. Certainly that was part of it, but he also considered Orthodox belief to be incompatible with true understanding of Judaism. Here's a quote from a sermon he delivered in 1937. Can we get the next slide, please? This is a sermon delivered in Columbus, Ohio, to the CCAR, the Central Conference of American Rabbis. And it was in 1937 in Columbus that the Columbus Platform was written. There is a vast difference, Rabbi Eisendrath said, between treasuring those traditions which arise naturally out of life and the habit of a people, which are but the external expression of an inner and heartfelt need, and our latter-day tendency to shop around for some dramatic or theatrical or sentimental effects which are calculated to draw large numbers to the synagogue. Instead of treating worship as a living, growing organism, we ponder it as a bare facade to be dressed up with the addition of what we suppose to be more artistic words or chanting rites than those at present available, with the result that what we achieve is not a burgeoning forth of some clear faith, but a vague kind of prettiness or sentimentality, which frequently disguises in the folds of traditionalism the fact that we believe very little or do not know precisely what we believe. And yet, as strongly worded as this is, if we fast forward to 1964, we find that Rabbi Eisendrath had moderated considerably his opinions on this matter. Speaking as an older rabbi, writing in 1964, he wrote this, addressing his younger and less experienced self. Next slide. Look here. Your thoughts of pre-World War II days were symptomatic of precisely what was wrong with Reform Judaism in its early days. You were so rationalistic, so universalistic, that you reduced Judaism to a bloodless set of ethical principles, a goof without a ruach, a body without a soul, a brain without emotion. Isn't that why so many already within the ranks of Reform Jewry complained that Reform Judaism was cold? And isn't that why so many outside, amongst the multitudes of unaffiliated, refused to join, protesting that your services reminded them of a Protestant church? Well, they were right, and you contributed to that situation of the frozen people. rather a turnaround. This, was, I guess, sort of a pattern we're going to see again in Rabbi Eisendrath's evolution and development. Because I'm going to turn next to a discussion of his attitudes regarding Zionism. Now, Zionism, I mentioned already, was the other controversy that Rabbi Eisendrath encountered on his arrival in Toronto. It began with this editorial. Next slide, please. Published in the Canadian Jewish Review on September 1929. It was titled "We Pacifists." The Canadian Jewish Review was a weekly newspaper published in Canada since 1921 rather. Rabbi Brickner and Rabbi Isserman had been contributing editors. They had written weekly editorials, and Rabbi Eisendrath was granted the same privilege. His first editorial in the paper the week before was a rather bland piece, simply greeting Canadian Jewry. His second editorial was written against the background of the following events: that in August 1924 of 1929, in August 24 of 1929, an Arab riot had broken out in Hebron. 67 defenseless Jews were killed, some very violently that first day. And as unrest spread throughout Palestine to other cities, additional lives, Jewish and Arab, were lost. And Toronto Jewry was deeply moved by this. In Toronto, a parade was held to press the British into accepting a brigade of Canadian Jews to create a proposed Jewish legion to safeguard the Jews of Zion. Rabbi Eisendrath, who was an ardent pacifist, opposed this entirely. And his editorial was about this. Now, the editorial is a rather cold and unsympathetic work when you read it. Rabbi Eisendrath does not condemn Arab violence. He does not express sympathy for Jewish suffering. He does not, except in his final sentence, call for charitable aid to flow towards the Jews in Palestine, many of whom were driven from their homes and businesses. He does not call for the British to be more resolute in keeping the peace. His editorial instead is a rather dry scholarly refutation, at least in the first half, of works written by two contemporary Jewish writers, Maurice Samuel and Ludwig Lewison. Both these writers had expressed a thesis that Gentiles were by nature more militaristic and Jews more pacifistic. Rabbi Eisendrath saw in the contemporary response to events in Palestine evidence that Jews were every bit as militaristic as Gentiles. And he argued that point. But that bit of scholarly criticism alone probably would have provoked only a slight reaction. But Rabbi Eisendrath continued with this, quote, "Our whole response has been military. But what earthly use, I ask, is Palestine, its university, its Tel Avivs, its Wailing Walls, if it fails to exemplify the fundamental Hebraic idea of peace? Not by nature are we pacific, but we have a great opportunity to demonstrate to the world our traditional idealism by dwelling together with the Arab and Christian in harmony and peace." Years later, in his book, Can Faith Survive, Rabbi Eisendrath described what happened next. I'll read a little bit from that. "The day after the publication of my editorial, the Yiddish Journal of Toronto carried a bold headline across its entire front page, 'Verdammte Narrigkeit und Chutzpah,' which might be translated as 'damned foolishness and effrontery.' and the press called upon my congregation's leaders to dismiss me peremptorily. The leaders of the Canadian Zionist movement, some of the members of my congregation for a week asked for a meeting with my officers. The conference was held, and the specific request for my prompt dismissal was officially placed before them. The congregational leaders refused to be stampeded, however. The august board of Holy Blossom would not be panicked, nor would its members be so unprincipled as to jeopardize a rabbi's entire career because of a single unpopular statement. Quite something. The Canadian Jewish Review at the time allowed a diversity of opinion amongst its editorial writers, and one of the other editorial writers was A.B. Archie Bennett, and Bennett responded the following week with a front page editorial attacking Rabbi Eisendrath's position. Assuming, Bennett wrote, that for some reason Jews ought to be pacifists, does that mean that when attacked by a mob of rioters, they should not lift a finger to defend themselves? Eisendrath responded that he had been misrepresented the following week in his editorial. There has been so much read into my editorial, which by the wildest conjecture could not be found implicit in the words themselves. Bennett replied the next week that by and large, readers of the Canadian Jewish Review were quite capable of understanding what they read, and so on and so on. This back and forth continued until other events intervened: Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Armistice Day, Eisendrath's inauguration, all of these occupying, at least temporarily, all of Rabbi Eisendrath's attention. So things might have stayed, but Rabbi Eisendrath characteristically could not let the topic rest. And on December 8, 1929, he picked up the thread again with a sermon entitled "What Price Palestine?" And maybe we can have the next slide. Here is page 1 of that manuscript. And listen to these opening words. I know of no subject upon which I have ever spoken, that I have ever approached with such apprehension as this tangled and tragic problem of Palestine. I have addressed rabid militarisms on pacifism. I have championed the cause of the persecuted Negro in the bitter South. I have urged the right of a Roman Catholic to become the President of the United States in the surging hotbed of the Ku Klux Klan. But never have I felt greater trepidation than I do today in addressing Toronto Jewry upon the topic of the Holy Land. For in all my experience, I have never encountered as feverish a fanaticism, as frenzied a zeal, as opinion and stiff-necked dogmatism as exists in the city of Toronto. Not a charm offensive, not an olive branch being extended here to settle the ill will between him and the Zionists. The sermon continues, and I have to say that notwithstanding this polemic beginning, Rabbi Eisendrath does manage to settle himself, and what follows was a very well-written and informative historical summary that described the Jewish claim to the land, the history of exile and return, the accomplishment of the Halitsim, and so on, and also the history of the Arabs in the land, the basis of their claim, the reasons for their resentment. Rabbi Judah Magnus, at the time, a Reform rabbi and president of the Hebrew University, led a group called Ichud, which advocated for a binational state in Palestine. This was a state that would be neither Arab nor Jewish, And this was the solution that Rabbi Eisendrath wanted to see. He did not believe that the foundation of a Jewish state was essential to the dream of Zionism. Here's a quote from the sermon. If this, he's referring to the foundation of a state, if this be the ideal for which the Jew has fought and suffered these many centuries, of what avail its fruition? Zion is too noble a dream, too fine a vision, too glorious a hope to be desecrated by the mere physical establishment of another petty state, feverish with pride, arrogant with power, another banner unfurled amidst the confusion of flags and frontiers already existing upon this earth. Well, intense as the conflict between Rabbi Eisendrath and the Zionists was, it was not fatal to him. This we know. Here, next slide, please. He is at Sukkot with the first confirmation class. He's survived the year, and here he is with his confirmands. And closely tied to Rabbi Eisendrath's Zionism and his attitudes regarding it was his pacifism. He was a committed pacifist. You can see that from his sermon, in which he begins by referring to his opponents as rabid militarists, and which he ends by denigrating the idea of the mere establishment of another petty state, feverish with power. November 10, 1929, the day before Armistice Day, Rabbi Eisendrath delivered a sermon which was anti-war, pro-pacifist, anti-militarist in all its aspects, whereas other rabbis on that day might have recalled the sacrifices that members of the congregation had made during the war, might have offered condolence and support to the families of the veterans. Rabbi Eisendrath chose instead to speak about writers who were preserving the memory of the horrors of war, and to worry about veterans who were now reflecting fondly on their experiences during the war, and to young people who had not experienced the horrors of war. And the following year, next slide, please. Rabbi Eisendrath participated in an all-day peace conference. This was held November 10, 1930, and here's a poster announcing that conference. And it's very striking to see here the prominent role that Rabbi Eisendrath played in organizing and participating in this conference. It was held under the auspices of the Fellowship of Reconciliation and affiliated peace groups in Toronto, and the chairman, and I've highlighted it here in yellow, was Rabbi Eisendrath. Some other participants: Archbishop Neil McNeil, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Toronto; Reverend E. Crossley Hunter, a minister of the United Church; J.S. Woodsworth, MP, originally a Methodist minister, later the first leader of the CCF party, which was the predecessor of the federal NDP. Salem Bland is mentioned. Salem Bland was a Methodist and a United Church minister, and a prominent proponent of the social gospel movement in Canada. This was the movement to which Tommy Douglas belonged. And Tommy Douglas was the founder and the father of Medicare in Canada. Salem Bland was also an editorial writer under the pseudonym Observer for the Toronto Daily Star. It's astonishing, really, how quickly Rabbi Eisendrath assumed positions of leadership in the broader Toronto community and formed links with other high-ranking religious and political personalities. All this, of course, was in 1930, before Hitler came to power, before all the horrors that happened, when it was still possible for a rabbi to be a pacifist. In these matters, of course, Rabbi Eisendrath eventually had to change. By 1935, his conversion was complete. That year, he visited Germany and Palestine. Returning to North America, he stopped in New York. He was greeted by a reporter who filed this report. The Jews of Germany, like the primitive tribes of America, are these days praying for rain. Their prayers are, however, not inspired by crops imperiled by prolonged drought, but by the tragic circumstances that only when it rains dare the Jews of Germany emerge from their barred and barricaded homes to walk without fear of molestation on the public streets. When a heavy downpour drenches the pavements and drives hoodlums indoors, Berlin's streets are crowded with Jews seeking a few breaths of fresh air. This pathetic picture was given by Rabbi Maurice N. Eisendrath of Toronto, Canada, one of the leading younger figures in the Reform Rabbinate, in an interview during a stopover in New York en route to Toronto. Rabbi Eisendrath had just returned from an extended tour of Europe and Palestine and stopped over to confer with the officers of the United Jewish Appeal, of the Joint Distribution Committee, and the American Palestine Campaign on their plans to raise $3,250,000 in this country for aid to the Jews of Germany and other lands and for their settlement in Palestine. In Palestine, Rabbi Eisendrath said he had spoken to hundreds of young Germans who were exuberant and joyful over their escape from Germany. Magnificent work, he said, had been done providing habitation for these refugees, and some of the finest buildings he saw in most of the colonies were built with relief funds. The German youth, he added, are unanimous in their desire to rebuild their lives, and they want nothing more than to make a complete break from everything that is German, land, language, culture, and to reshape their lives in Palestine. Rabbi Eisendrath, during his week in Palestine, was conducted around the country by a young member of the Histadrut, the labor union movement, who had been assigned to be his guide and to take him on a tour of the kibbutzim. That guide was Golda Meir. And Rabbi Eisendrath was very moved by what he saw. He wrote this: I learned there was quite a difference between standing in a pulpit decrying the evils of nationalism and the visceral commitment to one's own land, writing an abstract editorial, advocating non-retaliatory, peaceful coexistence with the Arabs, regardless of provocation, and standing on a hillside, overlooking the blood-spattered ruins of once had been a thriving Jewish settlement. I could go on. I won't, because I want to move on to the next episode of Rabbi Eisendrath's time in Toronto, a fascinating one, I think, which is not very well known. Next slide, please. All right, so this is Ira Junius Johnson and Isabel Jones. two people who were married in 1930, and I want to talk about Rabbi Eisendrath's connection with them and his indirect involvement in their lives. Isabel Jones was white. Ira Junius Johnson was black. And Isabel's mother was not in favor of the marriage. And she appealed to the Ku Klux Klan, which was active in Hamilton and in Toronto and elsewhere in Canada at the time, to intervene. And on a night in March of 1930, 50 to 75 hooded members of the Klan descended on Oakville. They burned a cross on the main street of Oakville. Another cross was set afire outside the residence where Isabel Jones was staying. She was placed in a car and driven to a Salvation Army residence. Ira Johnson's mother was warned that if her son was ever seen walking down the street with a white girl again, the Klan would attend to him. The police chief of Oakville encountered the Klan on their way out of the town. He did nothing to apprehend them. A provincial investigation, however, did ensue, and 3 men were charged. At trial, 1 was convicted, Dr. William Phillips. He was a chiropractor. He was fined $50. This later on appeal was increased to a sentence of 3 months in jail, but this was not yet to be known. The affair was widely reported in the newspapers and the editorial pages of Toronto publications. Opinion was broadly against the Klan, but talked more about how they had taken the law into their own hands, and less about their doctrine of racial superiority. Rabbi Eisendrath made this the topic of his sermon on March 23, 1930. Now, none of this background is mentioned in Rabbi Eisendrath's sermon, and from this we can infer that the events were so notorious at the time that he found no need to recite them. But he did make sure to give his listeners an accurate description of Klan doctrine. He quoted from a work by Hiram Wesley Evans, the so-called Grand Kleagle of the KKK. And succinctly, the doctrine was this, that the Klan represents the Nordic race, the race which, the Klan said, with all its faults, had given the world almost the whole of modern civilization, and that the Nordic race was threatened by foreign races, and the Klan had been organized to defend our loved ones and our culture from the danger of these foreign races. This was the basis of the Klan's notorious prejudices against Catholics, against Negroes, against Jews. Catholics, the Klan preached, were dominated by non-Nordic Italian popes. Negroes could never claim equality with whites. Jews stubbornly refused to assimilate. And Rabbi Eisendrath attacks the Klan ideology and its principles with, I think, some of the most passionate, inflamed oratory that we read in any of his sermons. Here's a quote: "Impudent in action, sinister in motive, bestial in conception, vicious in method, pernicious in purpose, flagrant and frenzied and fanatic in the execution of its illegal, irreligious, un-British designs. It threatens the moral integrity and the stability of our nation, and unless summarily and speedily brought to justice by the prosecution of the ideals of this dominion, It will turn one people against the other in hatred and contempt. Protestant against Catholic, white against Negro, Christian against Jew, until even this wondrously cosmopolitan land will be torn by inner dissension and strife until it perish in the blood of its own internal feud. Rabbi Eisendrath goes on to discuss the pseudoscientific basis that the Klan presented for its claims. He quotes from anthropologists and university scholars of the time. The division of men into races, Nordic, Alpine, Caucasian, Mongolian, Semitic, etc., is solely for the purpose of convenience as a means of categorizing different groups. But a pure racial type exists purely in our imagination. We have no anatomical or physiological evidence which can prove that physically or mentally the white race is the highest type of man. This was characteristic from time to time of what we see in Rabbi Eisendrath's sermons. He could be quite scholarly and scientific, turning to professors and to outside experts to bolster his case. But Rabbi Eisendrath's criticism was not just directed to members of the Klan. He turned his attention next to members of his own congregation. He warned of tacit submission to Klan gospel, and he criticized those who would publicly condemn the Klan for its tactics, but privately approve of its goals. Frustratingly, our manuscript of this sermon ends in a rather chaotic manner. We seem to have portions of two alternate endings which Rabbi Eisendrath wrote. From newspaper reports, we do know, however, that the sermon was delivered. And we also know from the newspaper that Ira and Isabel were married. In fact, they were married the day before Rabbi Eisendrath delivered his sermon, although he may not have known that at the time. This sermon, in many ways, exemplifies Rabbi Eisendrath's personal conception of Judaism. He believed that it was in the nature of Judaism to be progressive, that Judaism should be rational, modern, and scientific, and he believed that our Jewish experience obligated us to engage with the world with a message of social justice. Rabbi Eisendrath remained at Holy Blossom until 1943. In 1943, he was called to assume the position of director, at first temporarily, at the Union of American Hebrew Congregations in Cincinnati. When Nelson Gluck, who was supposed to assume the position, announced that he was unable to return from the Middle East where he was doing other work, Rabbi Eisendrath was given the position permanently. He led the UHC up until 1973. He was supposed to retire officially at the UHC biennial in 1973, and the evening before he was to give his last sermon, he died of a heart attack, a very dramatic exit. That sermon would have been as strong and a sermon and a proclamation of social justice ideals as any he'd ever given, I think. It certainly has strong messages against the Vietnam War. And that was Rabbi Eisendrath's career.
And Mark Gatian shared that he was there. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I was a group of us, Nifty, at the 1973 biennial. He wanted to see us before Shabbat dinner and services, so we all went up to his suite and spent about an hour with him before Shabbat began, and then we left, and he died just after we left in his suite.
My goodness.
You knew him, Mark, rather well.
I knew him very well. The other thing is, not only did I know him well, but I knew him because I worked in the New York office, but I also in 1973, Rabbi Plaut was with us at the biennial in New York City. It was at the New York Hilton over on 7th Avenue. We went up to his suite, as I said, the Nifty, those of us, there were about 5 of us from Nifty, Nifty youth leaders, and he died thereafter. And then on the Sunday, he died Friday night, early Friday, actually, right before Shabbat. Sunday, there was a memorial service for him at Central Synagogue, which was several blocks away over on Lexington. And Rabbi Platt was at the came over, and all of us who were from Holy Blossom at the biennial, of course, participated and went to the memorial service. Rabbi Platt participated in that service, and then a few days later, he was brought here to Toronto, and he's buried at Brimley.
What were your, if we have time, and I don't want to kind of, Howard wants to say more, but what were your impressions of him?
Well, I said a moment ago, I thought he was an amazing person. I learned a lot. The year I took a year off and worked as Nifty president in New York City. I lived in New York and had an office at the Union, and my office was on the 8th floor. Rabbi Eisendrath's office was on the 9th floor, and he would invite me to meetings, and I would spend time with him in his office, and I really got to know him very well. And he was an extraordinary person. He was a real visionary, even if you didn't always agree with his particular political or visionary views about things. He was a visionary and really had a direction for the movement from the time he took over the presidency in as Howard said, in 1943. And it was tragic when he passed away in 73. And Rabbi Schindler, actually, I should mention this, when he died just a few hours before he was to give his presidential, in those years in the biennial, the president of the Eisendrath and then Schindler would give their presidential sermon at the Friday evening service at the biennial. So that night, Rabbi Schindler delivered Rabbi Eisendrath's presidential sermon, and it was quite, as you can imagine, a very emotional evening and a very dramatic evening. Eisendrath and then Alexander Schindler had to take over as president at a time when he was sort of being groomed for it, but he wasn't expecting to become president that weekend, right?
So I'm gonna wrap us up by mentioning a couple of things which are gonna tie through coming up. I know we're gonna have a talk very soon on the architecture, and you saw that picture of Holy Blossom on Bond Street. There it is right there. Also in that first confirmation picture, you see, of course, the women participating. We spoke about that a little before. That's the ordination picture. So there's a couple of threads, of course, the issue of wearing hats or not, which of course our senior rabbi today is the first senior rabbi in a long time not to wear a hat when they're leading services. We've returned to the days of Eisendrath. And so next week, of course, is with Michael Cole, talking about Heinz Warschauer. I know many more people have stories of Heinz. The week after, if my computer will let me scroll, there we go. We'll talk about social justice, Rabbi Feinberg and Rabbi Plaut, which many, many more people are talking about the organ and music in our sanctuaries. And then on August 4th, of course, sharing our stories. There have been a couple of questions about recordings. And these sessions are being recorded. Katie Goodman is putting them up as links right now on YouTube. We'll get them connected to the website, and it'll take me a couple of days to try to, to get from Katie the links, and hopefully we'll get a page that we can land on and watch them all together. And I hope to get that out soon so people can catch up if they haven't. And
I sent an email to you, Jordan. Howard, I would love to get your lecture notes and your slides, if possible.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you.
And a question from Susan Baskin: how old was he when he passed away?
71.
71.
71 or 73, I think.
He was born in 1902.
71, yeah. That's right, 71.
So I know he had, of course, more to share even that evening, right? So the sessions continue, and You can stay to schmooze for a bit. I've got to run to my next meeting. But so really so amazing to have so many that are interested and engaged in Holy Blossom's history. And thank you, of course, to our archivists for unlocking it for us yet again.
This was great. Thank you so much, Howard. It was excellent. Really excellent.
My pleasure.
It was great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Here, here.
Really helpful. Thank you so much. It's Judy speaking.